Welcome, everybody. My name is Vikas. I'm Vikas Sani. I'm part of the executive committee of the Right Care Alliance, and we're the organization putting on this town hall on this new medication called branded Aduhelm and generically called aducanumab, if you can get that. So the purpose of this town hall really is to gather a lot of information and get synchronized up with the Right Care Alliance community. We're ready to welcome others as well. And as you enter, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and say a little bit if you want. It's going to be very busy in the chat, I'm sure. We have 100 people so far. We're going to talk a little bit about the issue, and we're also going to share some ideas for what we might do about it. We're going to have a series of 3 speakers, guest speakers. Then we'll have one of the other members of the executive committee of the Right Care Alliance give us some information towards the end, and then we'll close it out. We are going to have breakouts about halfway through this, and the breakouts you're going to be assigned randomly. Those of you who are Zoom veterans may know what that's like, but you'll be assigned randomly to a group. There'll be a facilitator, and there you'll have a chance to share your ideas, reactions, thoughts, and suggestions. There is an opportunity to read what everyone's saying using closed captioning, and you can do that by going to the bottom strip where there's a closed caption button. And if you click on that, you can turn captions on and off. Lastly, a lot of people asked for slides, and we didn't send any ahead of time because, simply put, there aren't any. We have a couple of photos from one of our speakers, and that's the extent of it. So without further ado, let's get on with the program. I'm really honored and pleased to be able to introduce our first speaker, Erin Kesselheim. Dr. Kesselheim is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's an internist on the staff at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's trained as a lawyer as well. And as many of you will know, he was recently serving on the FDA advisory panel that reviewed the evidence for the efficacy and safety of this medication, Aduhelm. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Erin Kesselheim.
Thank you, Vikas, and thanks to the group. I'm excited to hear the conversation. Vikas asked me to get things started by just providing a little bit of background on the approval of aducanumab, and I'm going to try to walk through some of the steps to try to understand what the controversy is, and maybe highlight some points of policy points going forward to try to think about how this community or other communities can respond. So I guess, to start with, I guess I just want to make clear that just kind of set a ground level for everybody. In order to get a drug approved by the FDA, you have to show substantial evidence of effectiveness from adequate and well-controlled studies, and as well as demonstrating sufficient safety. And those rules have been in place, those kind of statutory standards have been in place since 1962. The sort of phased development of a drug, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, it really developed out of those rules in order to provide sort of stepped demonstration of a drug's effectiveness. Now, again, the law doesn't require any particular p-value or any evidence of how much effectiveness is necessary, just that there be substantial evidence that there be effectiveness. And the FDA has traditionally interpreted that to prefer 2 adequate and well-controlled studies because any single study can be subject to unanticipated, undetected systematic biases. That preference started becoming particularly controversial around the time of the HIV epidemic in the 1980s, and in response to reasonable considerations that there are some diseases or conditions for which patients may accept more risk in approving new drugs and getting drugs out on the market. The FDA and Congress developed a series of expedited pathways after the 1980s, one of which is the accelerated approval pathway, which is the basis for the aducanumab decision. So accelerated approval allows the FDA to approve a drug on the basis of a surrogate measure that is only reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. So a surrogate measure is a biomarker or a laboratory test or some other kind of measurement that and is to be contrasted with a clinical endpoint. A clinical endpoint is how a patient feels, functions, or survives, and that's why we treat patients and why we give drugs is to sort of improve them on one of those clinical endpoints. But there are surrogate measures out there that are known to be well validated, which is to say well connected with a clinical endpoint. So take LDL cholesterol. Nobody actually cares what your LDL cholesterol level is, but we do know that changing your LDL cholesterol in a patient who had a history of heart disease can reduce your risk of further cardiovascular disease or stroke or something like that. And so that's a surrogate measure. And so, we know that that's why we treat people with statins and follow their LDL levels. The problem comes when you have surrogate measures that aren't as well connected with actual clinical endpoints as in that case. And there are a lot of them out there. Medical history is riddled with surrogate measures that we've used to treat or even approve drugs on that once that drug is tested in a rigorous, well-controlled study, shows that the drug actually doesn't work or in even worse, harms patients. And so there are, again, a lot of examples of those. And the FDA approves a lot of drugs based on surrogate measures. The accelerated approval pathway allows the FDA to approve drugs on the basis of surrogate measures that are only reasonably likely to predict an actual clinical benefit. So it takes the surrogate measure and moves it, one step further into uncertainty. And as part of the quid pro quo of accelerated approval, the drug company is required to do a confirmatory study after the drug is approved. And that's actually one of the only cases where the FDA can require the conduct of a confirmatory study. The FDA asks companies to do post-approval studies a lot, and there's a lot of controversy about whether or not companies actually do those studies in a timely fashion or in a rigorous way. Accelerated approval requires a post-approval confirmatory study, and then the FDA will, if the confirmatory study is positive, will change the approval from accelerated approval to regular approval. And accelerated approval also includes a disclaimer in the official labeling that the FDA will remove on that point. Now, we've actually done some research showing that the accelerated approval pathway does not work in all cases as well as it should. A lot of these confirmatory studies, particularly in recent years, have been delayed. It takes, we looked at a bunch of accelerated approval cancer drugs and found that it takes on average about 5 years for those confirmatory studies to be completed. In many cases, unfortunately, with cancer drugs, confirmatory accelerated approval studies use the same surrogate endpoint that is used in the original accelerated approval, which again shouldn't really be. At the point at which the drug's now on the market, the drug should be tested in an accelerated on a real endpoint. And in some cases, the FDA, the confirmatory trial has been negative, and the FDA hasn't taken steps to remove the indication from the labeling or even the drug from the market. So there are a lot of problems with accelerated approval. Another one of which, of course, is that once a drug gets approved in the US, drug companies can charge whatever they want. And there is accelerated approval drugs cost a whole lot of money, despite the fact that they haven't been demonstrated to work. And we don't have any real way to set or negotiate lower drug prices right now in the US. And that is particularly impactful in the case of accelerated approvals, which historically include about 10% of new drug approvals, now account for, I think, closer to about 20% of new drug approvals. Okay, so with that as the background, let me kind of talk about aducanumab, the sort of main point of today's conversation. Aducanumab is a monoclonal antibody that was designed to reduce amyloid plaque in the brains of patients. And amyloid plaque is an aggregation of proteins that is observable by PET scans in patients who have Alzheimer's disease. It is also, by the way, observable in patients who don't have Alzheimer's disease, and there are patients with Alzheimer's disease who don't have amyloid plaque. Nonetheless, over the last 20 years, researchers have been focused on amyloid plaques, thinking that if you reduce these tangles of protein, that you might be able to affect the course of Alzheimer's disease. Unfortunately, that hasn't really worked, and there has been a lot of drugs that have targeted amyloid plaques, some more successfully than others, with an attempt to try to change the course of Alzheimer's disease. And none of those drugs have actually shown to be clinically effective. Some of them have actually even worsened cognition. But aducanumab came out as kind of the next generation, the newest thing, a new horizon in amyloid treatments, because it actually did do quite a good job at reducing visible amyloid plaques from the brain. And on the basis of that, Biogen, its manufacturer, to its credit, organized two trials to do, two phase 3 randomized trials to try to show the clinical impact of aducanumab. And these are two identically designed trials that were set to go around the same time, and they involved a high dose, a low dose, and a placebo that patients were randomized to. It was set up that the trials would have an interim analysis by their data safety monitoring board, an interim combined analysis by the data safety monitoring board to determine whether or not it looked like the trials were futile and the drug wasn't working. And so about halfway through the trial, when the data safety monitoring board reviewed the trials in combination, it declared that the drug was futile, and it didn't appear that the drug was going to have any effectiveness. And so Biogen very publicly pulled the plug on the clinical trials. While it was wrapping up the clinical trials, a little bit more data came in, and Biogen went back and reviewed the two trials separately. And what they found was that in one of the trials, in the high dose arm, there was a statistically significant reduction in the progress of cognitive dysfunction in those patients. Now, the drug didn't cure Alzheimer's disease. It didn't reduce cognitive function or improve cognitive function back to baseline. It just, reduced the decline a little bit by about 20% over 18 months of therapy. On this 18-point cognitive function scale, it changed the cognitive function by about 0.39. So it was, instead of being reduced by about 0.4, it was improved by that much. And so on. But the other trial that was designed exactly the same way, that one was negative. And in fact, the people on the placebo did numerically worse, even though it wasn't statistically significant. So on the basis of that data, Biogen went to the FDA, and Biogen and the FDA worked to try to figure out why one of the trials was positive and the other trial was negative. And they came up with all of these theories as to why that might be the case. For example, they said, that there were more people who progressed more quickly with their Alzheimer's disease in the negative trial. And if you took those patients out, that trial would have been positive. But of course, if you take out the worst performing people in your study in any trial, you're going to find that the drug is going to appear to work. And that's why you don't do that. So they brought all of this, these post hoc analyses, these kind of after the fact reanalyses of the study, to the advisory committee that I was a part of that met back in November. And we as an advisory committee reviewed all of this information. And by the way, also looked at the safety information. They found that about a third of patients had this evidence of brain swelling or microhemorrhages on MRI scan called ARIA. A lot of those cases were not clinically significant, but some of them were clinically significant. But they occurred in about a third of patients in the trials. And we, as a committee, voted nearly unanimously that the drug didn't appear to have convincing evidence that it affected cognitive function. It at best it was conflicting evidence and suggested that we needed more study to try to understand what was going on here. And so that was what we did. And instead, so 6 months passed, we didn't really hear anything. And then in June, the FDA approved the drug. But importantly, they didn't approve the drug on the basis of its effect on cognitive function. They approved the drug using the accelerated approval pathway, saying that on the basis of its removing amyloid plaque from the brain, we think that it's reasonably likely that the drug will have a clinical impact. Importantly, when the issue of amyloid plaque came up back in November, the FDA explicitly said, look, we're not considering amyloid plaque as the basis for approval. So they switched their premise for approving the drug in the last 6 months. So there were other problems or irregularities. So this is, by the way, highly irregular for the FDA to switch the premise on which it was approving the drug at the very last minute like that. And accelerated approval was not intended to be the fallback position that you use when you can't get enough, you can't convince an independent panel that your drug is clinically effective. Now, again, the FDA doesn't have to follow the advisory committee's recommendations. And in fact, the FDA doesn't follow advisory committee recommendations about 25% of the time. But usually when the FDA doesn't follow advisory committee recommendations, first of all, it's not a unanimous committee vote. And second of all, it's usually in the order of being more conservative, not in the order of approving a drug when the advisory committee votes it down. So that's also relatively unique. And then, of course, there's been reporting in the news since then that that the FDA actually was considering accelerated approval at the time of the advisory committee and had some off-the-books meetings with people from Biogen that really shouldn't have happened. And Janet Woodcock has called for an investigation by the Office of Inspector General about those interactions. And there are a couple congressional hearings that are pending as well about the process. Other problematic aspects of the process, the FDA approved the drug for all patients with Alzheimer's disease initially, although it subsequently edited the label to say that the drug should be started in patients with early Alzheimer's disease. And the FDA gave the company 9 years to complete its post-approval confirmatory study, which is much longer than the average amount of time it usually gives for post-approval confirmatory studies. Of course, we don't really know what the confirmatory studies will show and if the FDA will be able to act on them at that point anyway. But usually confirmatory studies should be underway at the time the drug is approved. And then finally, Biogen made the drug available for $57,000 a year for a patient of average weight with Alzheimer's disease. And obviously that is exceedingly higher than what we might expect. The independent group ICER evaluated the drug and said that even if you assume the most positive assumptions about the drug's effect, that a more value or based price would be in the $3,000 to $8,000 a year. But again, it's impossible to do those analyses because, and again, I want to emphasize this, there is no good evidence that the drug works. There is at best conflicting evidence that the drug works, which should be the basis for subsequent research and study, not the basis for approving the drug and putting it out there on the market. And of course, people have raised concerns about this risk of brain bleeds and side effects that are, manageable in the very highly observable confines of a clinical trial, but may not be manageable in sort of widespread clinical use. And so anyway, I think those are my 15 minutes, and I am happy to answer any questions about it. I should announce again, I did resign for this, as Vikas said, I did resign from the committee in the wake of it. And I am, pleased that there's been so much discussion about this. I do think that the FDA is extremely important. I think the FDA usually makes good decisions, and I don't think the FDA made a good decision in this case, or that the process was a good process. And we need to try to figure out why that is and prevent that from happening again. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions that people will have. We are going to be fielding questions, and then we're going to have a Q&A, a moderated Q&A after. So if you have specific questions for specific speakers, throw them into the chat. We're monitoring it. Again, it's unlikely we'll get all the questions answered, but we'll do our best. So now I'd like to introduce Linda Ferlini. Uh, Both of Linda's parents were affected simultaneously by Alzheimer's disease at age 60, and she acted as their caregiver for 20 years. During that time, she became involved with the Alzheimer's Society of Canada at multiple levels. She then returned to academia and did her doctoral work on the educational needs of informal caregivers who care for people with Alzheimer's disease. She currently works in research ethics. She's a member of the Independent Voices for Safe and Effective Drugs, together with a group of academics, researchers, and patient and consumer advocates. They have no ties to the pharmaceutical industry. She also serves as vice president of Handicap Vie Dignité, which is in Montreal and has a mission to work to improve the quality of life of people with severe disabilities. Linda, thanks for joining us, and you have the floor.
Sorry. Okay, thank you very much for receiving me, for having me on. Although I live in Montreal, I'm profoundly disturbed by FDA's recent approval of Aduhelm. So I'll tell you a little bit about where I've been. At age 23, in 1979, I became a caregiver to both my parents affected by Alzheimer's disease at the age of 60. They were affected simultaneously. We had no family history of the disease, particularly at that age. From its onset, this disease had appalling consequences on my parents' lives. It also had devastating effects on my sisters and my life. One of the pictures posted, I don't know if it's posted, shows my sister at her high school graduation, together with my parents and me. In less than 2 years after that photo was taken, my parents would show obvious symptoms of the disease. My dad's illness lasted 10 years, while my mom's lasted 20. Overall, my caregiving experiences were negative, depressing, and it cast a very dark shadow over my young adult life. At the time, I was married, cared for a son. You see him today in the photo with my daughter-in-law and my grandchildren. I owned and operated a 6-day-a-week small family business that I inherited because of this disease, while simultaneously running both my household and that of my parents. I coordinated their care, constantly battled to obtain support and resources I needed, while dealing with the countless financial and practical issues brought on by my parents' inability to manage their personal affairs. So without the ability to obtain care resources to help me, I lived in a constant state of dread, anxiety, and distress, never knowing what was going to happen to me next. Like so many caregivers, even today, I lacked the credibility to be heard. Propelled by these negative experiences, I began volunteering and doing some professional work in the field of Alzheimer's care. Eventually, I completed my doctorate that focused on the educational needs of caregivers, which I think is very important for them to be supported. You can appreciate that for over 30 years, I've followed Alzheimer drug development intensely. I was witness to the first drugs that were approved and the strategies employed by the pharmaceutical industry, select researchers, and pharma-funded advocacy groups like the Alzheimer Society, the Canadian counterpart to the Alzheimer Association, to generate or promote false and self-serving information about them. Over the years, I gathered mountains of disinformation that had served to create false hope, harm, and confusion. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that pharma-funded groups like the Alzheimer's Society do provide valuable information and services. But when these groups accept funds from pharmaceutical companies, it places them in a compromised position, resulting in undue influence. This influence creates leverage, often forcing board members and staff to lobby for decisions that can turn a blind eye to the safety and effectiveness of drugs and misleading drug promotion. And this remains invisible to many of its members and the public. So when the FDA approved Aduhelm, I became overwhelmed with rage that later turned to profound sadness and weariness. So I understand and share the utter desperation of persons with Alzheimer's and caregivers wanting safe and effective treatment. So as a past caregiver, but also as a person who may be at high risk for Alzheimer's disease, why am I so distressed over this drug approval? My reasons focus on the lack of meaningful evidence that Erin just described and the failure to manage conflicts of interest. Many people enrolled in the Aduhelm clinical trials were not diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, but with mild cognitive impairment. Many people with mild cognitive impairment do not develop Alzheimer's, and for some, mild cognitive impairment may be due to other causes. So how can I have confidence in the evidence produced in these trials? The time period for testing this drug is relatively short, only 18 months. This disease progresses very slowly over a number of years, and its symptoms can wax and wane. They can be unpredictable, and sometimes they can plateau for years, as was the case with my mom. So how can I have confidence in the evidence produced by these trials? Aduhelm clinical trials were designed to prove cognitive or mental functioning of people with Alzheimer's disease would improve. So the results were disappointing, but the FDA and Biogen ignored them and looked at another less significant result, the reduction of amyloid plaques. And these results are controversial. More than that, despite 20 years of research, as was already stated, the reduction of amyloid plaques has not been found to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Others' research has revealed upon autopsy that the brains of some people showing a presence of plaques never developed Alzheimer's, while those without plaques did. So how can I have confidence in the evidence produced by the Aduhelm clinical trials? The FDA's own independent science advisory panel unanimously recommended against approving this drug, but the FDA rejected this decision. A government investigation was launched questioning whether the FDA actually conducted an arm's length approval process. So what confidence can I have in the approval process when the FDA rejected the decision of its very own independent advisory panel, and to boot, a government investigation has been launched? The probability of serious side effects from taking this drug is very high. These side effects include brain swelling, bleeding, microhemorrhages, visual gait disturbance, dizziness, nausea, headaches, diarrhea, confusion, disorientation, higher incidence of falls. A terrible outcome for people with Alzheimer's disease who are already struggling with their thinking and having difficulty understanding their world. What confidence can I have when these potential side effects of the drug can make the already terrible disease symptoms worse? This drug is estimated to cost $56,000 a year and does not include the cost of required tests. The cost is prohibitive for the average person. I foresee there will be incredible pressure to have this untrustworthy drug approved in Canada. Then almost unsurmountable pressure will be created to have the drug paid with Canadian hard-earned tax dollars through provincial drug plans. An application to Health Canada, our equivalent of the FDA, has already been filed. I'm extremely distressed to learn that the Alzheimer's Society has issued a press release asking for Aduhelm's approval. During a recent interview, the chief science officer of the Alzheimer's Society rightfully pointed to the controversial issues surrounding this drug, but then failed to advocate that Health Canada should not approve it. Instead, she said patients should make the choice themselves after speaking to their doctor. I question, if these bodies approve Aduhelm without evidence, why do we create them? Why do we need Health Canada and FDA? How then can I have confidence in the evidence that my doctor will rely on to advise me? I conclude by saying families are desperate for care resources. We are also desperate for more and different avenues of research, such as basic science and in research into the possible causes of the disease. With unreliable evidence, with evidence of potential harmful side effects, with extreme costs, we must spend our scarce health care dollars where they belong, in better research and on care resources that will deliver an actual return to our struggling healthcare systems.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you. That was powerful. So again, if you have questions for Linda, please put them up into the chat. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Whitehouse, MD PhD. He's a transdisciplinary designer, and he's an activist, but he is most importantly an expert in the field of cognitive and brain health, integrated healthcare, and he serves on the faculty as professor at Case Western Reserve University and as an international professor at the University of Toronto. Peter, thank you for joining us. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Vikas and Erin and Linda, for such a great start to an important conversation. I, as a clinician, a scientist, a family member, caregiver, an ethicist, public health advocate, and a citizen, I think this was a terrible decision. What I'm going to hope to add to the conversation is some perspective for being in the Alzheimer's field for 50 years, both representing neurology, psychiatry, and geriatrics. This perspective started when I was at Hopkins doing basic science research on the cholinergic mechanisms, which are damaged in these conditions that we are studying. And I use the word conditions here for a reason I'll explain in a minute, that led to the first generation of drugs that Linda mentioned. And there certainly were challenges in that domain. But after being on the FDA panel and somewhat reluctantly voting for approval, I used them. And I also started a group called the International Working Group for the Harmonization of Dementia Drug Guidelines. This was a group that existed in the late 1990s that involved the FDA, the European Regulatory Agency, the Japanese Regulatory Agency, and Canada, where I've done work, as Vikas mentioned, trying to understand how we should, as a world, think through what drugs would be, how we should approve drugs for dementia. And part of that process was to write papers, including one that I wrote on models for slowing progression of disease that didn't use biomarkers. There are other clinical ways of trying to establish disease modification. I worked actively with the pharmaceutical industry at that time, but eventually came to see them as not a positive force for health. And I wrote a paper in 2008 called Why I No Longer Consult for the Pharmaceutical Industry. I want to examine the accelerated approval you've already heard from our other speakers from that perspective, that historical perspective. So let's talk for a minute about the fact that you need to have a serious, devastating disease. And Linda has described the effect of these processes on her parents, but I would say that Alzheimer's, what we've learned in those 50 years is Alzheimer's is not one disease. So when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, we've got to be very careful about recognizing there's a heterogeneity in that label that has changed several times since it was first described by Dr. Alzheimer in 1906. The other thing, as Linda has already introduced, is this is a medicine that's supposed to be used for mild cognitive impairment. That's a very controversial term that emerged out of research, I think, prematurely. And there are some inaccurate numbers floating around about how many people have mild cognitive impairment and what type. The Alzheimer's Association has also, in the United States, has also been promoting subjective cognitive decline, a condition earlier than mild cognitive impairment, where all you have to do is complain about the disease, complain about memory problems or cognitive loss. Now, Biogen has recently got upset because they claim we're using misinformation to attack the approval of the drug. And in actual fact, I would commend you all go to, but be careful, you won't pass the test, the website that Biogen developed called It's Time to Know. On that test, they ask you a whole bunch of questions about your memory and your ability to track information and to get lost if you're driving around. And practically speaking, everybody who takes the test fails and is told to go see a doctor, an infusion center, or a biomarker, get a biomarker amyloid imaging. It's not a validated scale, it's not scientific, it's marketing. And the other point about accelerated approval is you need a biomarker, as Erin described. In this case, the focus has been on amyloid imaging. There is not a consensus that amyloid imaging can relate to the clinical measures, even though you can argue that as to whether it was reasonably likely, but reasonably likely to whom? At that process, it was a small number of FDA experts and Biogen, whereas the field itself had given up on that idea. Now, I'm not saying that we won't find evidence potentially, but we really haven't looked. So I don't think it was reasonably likely. And I think that's why the scientific field is up in arms, because they don't think it's reasonably likely at this point in the development of that marker. The FDA and Biogen were involved in a 2018 paper that was published under the auspices of the Alzheimer's Association, which essentially removed clinical features from Alzheimer's disease. They developed a framing around amyloid, other biomarkers like tau and neurodegeneration, and they put people in boxes on the basis of biomarkers alone. Notice there are now boxes. So there are people that have variability in these pathologies. So we know Alzheimer's disease is not one disease, it's heterogeneous. So Biogen was essentially invited to participate in the process of scientifically continuing the progress of making these unvalidated biomarkers more important. Let's go now quickly to other parts of the accelerated approval. Erin already talked about the follow-up studies that are requested are flawed for very many reasons. And the other argument that comes out of the accelerated approval is Biogen and the experts who are co-opted by the pharmaceutical industry are saying this is going to open up the doors to innovation. This, I think, is contentious, partly because you've already seen that Lilly and Roche, who have drugs that are similar to aducanumab, are actually now changing their own minds, not doing further studies, and are planning to apply to the FDA for approval based on the biomarker data that they have. So I think we're not going to see the floodgate of innovation. We're going to see the floodgate of Me Too drugs. Finally, just a couple of comments about more context. I have been involved in pharmacoeconomic studies. And the Alzheimer's Association, again, in 2015, published a report based on a hypothetical drug, which sounds a lot like aducanumab, saving us tens and hundreds of billions of dollars. When they did that modeling and made this claim, we're going to save all this money if we approve a drug like aducanumab, they modeled the cost of the drug as zero. How helpful is that to us? Finally, that's cost, but I want to talk about opportunity costs that Linda already alluded to. What would we do with this money if we didn't waste it on a drug whose benefit has not been adequately demonstrated? We would invest in public health. We would invest in communities. My wife and I started intergenerational public schools in which people with dementia develop meaningful interactions with kids. We could dance. We could do all kinds of things to promote a different way of thinking about aging-related cognitive changes, which isn't all based on, we've just got to find the right molecule and fix and cure this disease. So again, I repeat, after my experience in the field, my experiences with drug development, I think this was a huge mistake. It's not going to help patients, it's going to hurt society, and it's going to set back research. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. So thanks to all three of our speakers. We're going to pause now and take questions from the audience. We have a number that have been flying over the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Ains, Right Care Alliance's organizer, who's been one of the key people to make this night happen. So Steph, you have the floor, and let's hear what people have to say.
Great, thanks, Vikas. So there's a number of questions and answers that's happening in chat already, but one question that hasn't been addressed yet is a question from John, which is, how do pharmaceutical companies profit from so-called charitable donations to organizations like the Alzheimer's Association? I think this question could go to any of our panelists, any of you who want to jump in.
Linda, I think you were part of Alzheimer's Society, so you may have some insight.
How do they, I just want to hear the question again. How do they profit? How do they benefit?
Yes.
Well, they financially or?
The question is, how do pharmaceutical companies profit from so-called charitable donations to organizations like the Alzheimer's Association?
Well, it's the leverage they get. when I was part of the Alzheimer Society, the drugs just happened to come out, and they have enormous resources for creating communication plans. And when the first Aricept came out, I remember that, oh, they told the Alzheimer Association, we're going to help you with an educational plan. Because there wasn't much awareness at a certain point in time about Alzheimer's. We're going to help you with this. We're going to do this. We're going to do the other. Then what eventually happened was they created a resource for physicians. Basically, the resource for physicians, of course, they had their hand in all of this. And they said, okay, but it was really a drug promotion thing. It really wasn't so much about creating awareness and helping the average person or the society learn about the drug, but it was really about the doctors and how to prescribe the drugs. At least that's the way I saw it. And they benefit, I don't know, like I guess they get tax write-offs, but that's not my area. But I saw firsthand, they work in tandem and in places that you can't see, sometimes sponsoring conferences. They need resources. They get the company gives them donations in kind. And I was at the Alzheimer Association, attended the Alzheimer Association conference in 2000. I mean, there were all kinds of things that the drug company sponsored. All this, I mean, I just think it comes down to a very simple principle, is that you don't bite the hand that feeds you. So if you're getting money from the pharmaceutical companies, you know, are you going to, you know, how are you going to react if they position themselves in a certain way and they provide you with all this help and they help you survive financially?
Thank you, Linda. Next question. Do you have some more, Steph? I bet you do.
Sure do. Our next question is from Jack. What has to happen for the FDA to reverse their approval?
Peter or Erin, do you want to talk about the idea of reversal?
Well, I guess I would say, you know, a meteor would have to hit. I mean, I think that I don't know that the FDA has ever reversed approval. I guess, you know, maybe these investigations could find some, like, you know, major malfeasance going on, which, by the way, I just want to say for the record that I don't think is happening. You know, but so, you know, if there are some like major malfeasance, or if there was some, you know, unreported data that Biogen had, like those kinds of like really high levels of fraud, you know, that kind of stuff, I think that would lead the FDA to reverse its decision. I don't think the FDA is going to reverse its decision short of any of that. It would be, you know, it's hard enough to get the FDA to act on drugs that are subsequently shown in their confirmatory studies not to work, or that have safety problems, to get the FDA to withdraw indications or to withdraw drugs from the market, even with, you know, and right now we don't have any new information that we know of that's coming out. But I guess if new information comes out, then you know, that might change things. But I don't actually think fraud is what's going on here, so I don't think that that's going to happen.
I have a different view, but obviously my view is very much going to be a minority view on this, which is I think anything's possible, but it would take a really overwhelming political meteor. I don't think we need a physical meteor. Steph?
Our next question is from Patricia, and it's also to Erin. How does the 21st Century Cures Act play into the decision? Do you think aducanumab would have been approved if it hadn't been enacted? And Erin, if you can explain what the 21st Century Cures Act is too, please.
Sure. So the 21st Century Cures Act was a bill that was passed and signed in the last few weeks of the Obama presidency. It had a number of components that dealt with a number of different aspects of the drug development, ecosystem. You know, there were some parts of it that actually were positive, and that they provided additional funds for research in various areas. There were other parts of it that were a bit more controversial because they were focused on, different expedited pathways in sort of bolstering different expedited pathways for getting drugs and devices approved by the FDA. One of the things that the 21st Century Cures Act did, for example, was it, provided more attention to surrogate measures, and, gave the FDA various ways to certify surrogate measures, even though there wasn't necessarily great data behind them. It was basically expedited pathways for getting surrogate measures to be used as endpoints in clinical trials. So all that being said, I think that I don't think that the 21st Century Cures Act, even though again the debate here is around surrogate measures and the use of amyloid as a surrogate measure, I don't think that amyloid plaques used any of the pathways that were created in the 21st Century Cures Act to establish themselves as a surrogate measure. The amyloid plaques have been proposed and bandied about as a surrogate measure for many years, even before the 21st Century Cures Act. So I think that I don't see a direct connection between the 21st Century Cures Act and the aducanumab approval, other than the fact that the 21st Century Cures Act was about encouraging the FDA to make more, surrogate marker-based approvals, and here we have a approval based on a surrogate marker that it's unclear what the effect of it is.
Can I just add something to that, and it's about the word cure. Cure is a very powerful word, and there are relatively few illnesses we actually cure. The field has been focusing more on prevention, which fortunately gets us into a broader space of potential prevention, including public health. The Alzheimer's Association has been saying their goal is a cure by 2025. We're going to miss that. And in fact, for the reasons that I mentioned, Alzheimer's disease being very heterogeneous, the likelihood that we will find the magic bullet, which is always advocated for to drive research dollars towards biomedical models, is unlikely. And the problem is there are so many other things we could be doing rather than this false hope associated with things like acts that say, this is going to get us cures in the 21st century.
Thank you, Peter. So I'm looking at our agenda and we're actually running over time, but I'm sure we have maybe one more question and then we're going to have to move to breakouts.
And this is a great question, and it's towards Peter. And Peter, I'm going to ask you to give the short version, but the long version would be fascinating too. And the question is from Marina. What can we do as citizens to make our society more friendly for people with MCI or dementia?
So there are large movements called age-friendly communities, dementia-friendly communities that I've been involved in. What I say to these folks is, hey, listen, we just need friendlier communities for everybody. We're all at risk for Alzheimer's disease and age-related cognitive changes. So we need to have access to nature, access to walking, to socialization, education, as I mentioned in our intergenerational schools. Hey, listen, this is the real opportunity here. We think deeply about what we're doing with this decision and reverse it. I think it's possible. And prioritize other things. We can do things that help everybody and make a better society for all of us.
Thank you, Peter. All right. So we're now going to move to breakouts. And as we do, I'm looking at the count, it's 110. So we had made a decision earlier, we'd keep breakouts at 10. So that means we have 11 breakout groups. We're going to run till 7, let's make it 7:15. And then we're going to come back and then we'll close it out. So off we go.
So we're going to hear from a couple facilitators. I'm lucky enough that I got to pop into all of the different groups. So I'm just going to ask some of the facilitators to come off mute and tell us about what you talked about. So Jordan, if you can report back, what was going on with your group?
Yes, I want to apologize in advance. My 1-year-old son is in here with me. I'm sure you can hear his barn music playing in the background.
Love it. That's Zoom life. That's great.
But yes, we had really, really good conversation in my group. We had some people who were already well-knowledged on what was happening and then have a lot of experience in the healthcare field as well. And where I really found interesting when we started talking about what can we do after tonight? And of course, protests were brought up. But there were also some people who had ideas of how we can do other forms of protests, especially since maybe meeting in person isn't safe. I don't know if they're comfortable with me using their name or not, but I definitely want to give credit to the ideas where they are. But Reese had the idea of doing some type of virtual protest, especially for those who aren't in Boston to be able to join like an in-person one. And Neil also had the idea of reaching out to the people who are actually prescribing the medication, getting this information to them. And if we can stop them, you know, from prescribing it or partnering with the pharmaceutical companies, you know, that stops the drug from going out and, you know, giving false hope to these people.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Those are great ideas. We'll probably talk more about them even in a couple minutes. Alan, can you come off mute? What was going on in your group?
Yeah, several points. People were shocked that 9 years were allowed to do the confirmatory studies, and that 1/3 of the study group of the patients studied had serious side effects. Why wasn't it stopped at that point for that reason? We discussed the concept of fraud and corruption. People thought that was a little too strong a language to aim at this panel, although we'd like to know more about the panelists who met with Biogen. We didn't know much about that. Reports that people who are affected by Alzheimer's have been angered by this news, including the husband of a woman with Alzheimer's, that others first have the reaction that, oh, they're happy that some drug has been found that might help, and then disillusioned when they hear the news that it probably doesn't. In terms of next steps, it was suggested that people could demonstrate at the FDA headquarters, those who are in the Washington, D.C. area. And there was support for people in our area, in the Boston area, to actually demonstrate at Biogen, and perhaps getting people who are affected by Alzheimer's, either patients themselves or family members, to testify at such a demonstration. There was also a question raised about aligning ourselves with other organizations that are making, that have made statements protesting this course of events, and to sort of get together with those as we might. Also, that individuals and people throughout the Right Care Network could be writing letters to the editor and to Congress protesting how this has come down in terms of action steps.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Those are all really good ideas. Marina, over to you. What did your group talk about?
My group was really wonderful. We had a lot of experts in my group. So nobody was very, I guess it was almost expected that there's profiteering, or the way that everything's set up. One point that came out was that in comparison to the pharma industry, one thing that maybe we were missing is to being able to organize around a unified message, and what steps can we take to organize around a unified message, and kind of to develop, to give money into public health, and to develop our public health more, and also to increase cost transparency. And there are organizations that do that, but they are oftentimes targeted. And I guess, I don't know, Janice, did you want to talk about the organizations that you mentioned briefly, or?
I want to get to one more group, so I'm sorry, but Janice, please, or Marina, either of you, please put it into chat so we can get it. And the last group we'll hear from is Amal's group. Amal, if you can come off mute, what did your group talk about?
Echoing a lot of the same sentiments. We spent a lot of time talking about like feeling wary and like a lot of hopelessness, and trying to find the energy and resources to actually like get to work after this. And then we spent some time talking about like what individuals and then also as a collective we can do. And we had Lynette in our group who shared that she's working on like house meetings this summer, and maybe finding a way to collaborate and like get the folks who are on this call back and do something with that. But yeah, and then there was something Gary was sharing at the end that maybe he can put in chat that my group wanted to bring to the larger group.
Okay. Great. Thanks for that. Thanks to all of our facilitators. I wish I could call on everybody. We don't have time. Quick round of applause for our great facilitators. Awesome. Other facilitators, I know you are all taking notes, so please do keep note of that. Keep typing into chat so we can all revisit after this. And now I'll pass it over to Sharon and Vikas to close us out.
Great, thanks. So as we close out, I want to introduce Sharon Moon. She's a member of the executive committee of the Right Care Alliance. She's a lawyer by training, and she has experience both as a caregiver and as someone who's worked in the healthcare sector as a lawyer. So Sharon, you have the floor.
Thank you. I remember when my grandfather got a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. He was living in Florida with my grandmother, and we lived in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, my family, and my grandmother reported that he was violent. And so we knew that they couldn't stay living with one another and that we had to do something. Now, my family doesn't have much money. My grandfather hadn't saved much money. CMS here in the United States doesn't pay for long-term care. When we went around to check for nursing homes near us, we found that we were priced out for anything nice. My grandpa's doctor recommended a nursing home in Florida, and she said the staff was loving and it was clean. It was our best choice. That's where my grandfather went. I went to visit him, and I walked in, and I have to say, you know, it was very institutional, fluorescent lights. It was clean, but kind of dank and dingy. You know, it was old. I could see love in the staff, in the way they were talking and touching patients, but I immediately saw they were overwhelmed. There were many more patients than there were staff. And I came to my grandpa, and I saw that he was tied to the wheelchair by leather straps. And I leaned down to give him a kiss, and he said, and he talked in a Texas accent, even though he grew up in Texas, but he lived his life in New Jersey and Florida. He didn't really have that accent anymore, but he said, "Gal, get me a knife so that I can cut these straps and get out of here." And when I looked at him, I could see fear in his eyes, which is something I never saw in my grandfather's eyes before. And I knew my family had done the best we could. But my grandfather deserved better, and we deserve better. We deserve better choices. My grandfather died a few months later, and in my family, we said that he willed himself to die because he was sad and fearful. I want us to think about all of the good things we could do with $56,000. In a system based in love, you would never, ever use that money for this pill, never. You wouldn't give neurologists a financial incentive to prescribe this pill, but we do. In a system based in love, you never would. Our system is not based in caring. Costs keep going up and quality of care is going down. Our outcomes are going down. Life expectancy is going down. We saw the response to this pandemic. There's so much needless suffering. And here, at least at the Right Care Alliance, we could go on and on about problems in the healthcare system. This drug is one of many. But we think the problem is that healthcare here isn't seen as a right, but as a consumer good, a product, a place where you can corner the market legally. There are so many good people working in our healthcare system, but they have to fight the system to do the good they want to do. We believe healthcare is a right based in our humanity. It's foundational to our freedom and any notion of equal opportunity. We are building a movement to make that dream a reality. How? The way all social movements gain power. By coming together and linking arms, all in, not disease against disease, not insured against uninsured, not doctors separated from patients, all in, and not settling for Band-Aids that leave power with special interest groups like Big Pharma. Here we have hope. I'm hope. Steph is hope. Vikas is hope. Everyone you met in these breakout rooms is hope. All of you are hope. Hope isn't a naive belief that everything's going to turn out right. Hope is stepping up, speaking out, and working for what you know is right, no matter what. We don't have to live in a country where moneyed interests control our healthcare system. People made this system. People can change this system. Only people can change this system. Not academics talking to academics, not editorials, and not well-written journal articles. So all good, but none will change the system. The only thing that will change the system is all of us coming together in public spaces in love and power. Are you ready to do, not just hope? If you are, then join us. This will be a long, hard journey. We know that, and we are prepared. While we continue to build and grow, we are not sitting on our hands. We are taking action now. Will you stand in solidarity with other people who want to push back against what happened here with this drug? If so, please raise your hand. And let's say enough. Enough of the profiteering. And now Vikas is going to talk about next steps.
Wait, before that, do you want to invite everyone to answer Sharon's call, to come off mute and all together say, enough.
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 Yes,
Enough.
Enough.
Enough is enough.
Okay.
It is indeed.
Yeah, I might be able to say that.
It is indeed.
You want mine?
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. I just want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about my perspective and where I think we're going. Clearly, everything we've heard tonight is just one more outrage in a string of outrages coming from the medical industrial complex over the years. This issue is certainly not new, as we heard from Peter Whitehouse. And I can remember myself as a young cardiologist not knowing better, prescribing Aricept just to be able to give something to a patient, even though I actually never saw it actually work. And, you know, in a sense, I was doing something that what many doctors who don't know any better have been reduced to doing by the system we have. So, you know, as I look at this data and this information, you know, as a clinician, I think, well, compared to aducanumab, there's a lot simpler ways of getting a placebo response. Particularly when, you know, we know that some of these risks are actually significant. And as we know from pharmaceutical trials, those risks in limited studies get multiplied massively when a drug is unleashed on a population. So this is a massive experiment, if we're really being honest. So it's a horrible way to practice medicine. It's a horrible way to do drug policy. And I think one of the ironies here is actually that, you know, the COVID vaccines that actually work are still under emergency authorization and not approved, which gives a lot of political cover to people who kind of don't want to use them. Meanwhile, this thing is fully approved when it's not clear that it works at all. So I certainly agree with Erin, as he said publicly, that this is one of the worst decisions of the FDA that I've ever seen. I think it's really quite unprecedented. But I'll tell you what, the other thing that's unprecedented is the opposition that's been triggered. I mean, at least for me, I've been struck. The level of sentiment against this action by the FDA is also something I don't really recall seeing in my lifetime. So I think that gives us hope, but I think to Sharon's point, I put it a slightly different way, is that opposition is going to be useless. It's going to be powerless if it's just grumbling. So it has to be organized. I think we're all here because we want to work together, and we're all here because we recognize that if it's organized, sentiment like this can be converted into a real force in the world. And that, I think, is our task. So, you know, for that to happen, we got to come together. We need to think through a set of demands. We need to be strategic, try to analyze what is going on, what we can do that's winnable, and we need to then take plans for more effective action. Now, I'm from the school that says, you know, if you imagine something that's easy to win, you're not imagining enough. So I think we have to look for stretch goals here, because I think there's an opportunity. There are a lot of organizations and individuals who oppose this drug's approval already, and we need to work with them. Those of us in the RCA need to work with other organizations in a broad coalition, a broader coalition, that is for sure. But in my lifetime, I've seen lots of efforts, and many of them have lost. And I think one reason is that we have to move beyond our like-minded friends. We have to move beyond our like-minded organizations, because if we can organize beyond the usual suspects, then I think the current situation is one where there's an opportunity to really make a difference. Can we overturn the decision? I don't know. That would be a political meteor. But as I said, I don't think it's completely out of the question. I don't think the odds are zero. And I think part of what we have to do is bring new people into this fight, because that's how we can change this from this sort of fixed war of attrition with, you know, phony propaganda wars on Twitter and not much happening. It's kind of like trench warfare. But if we can get new people and new organizations, they can sweep into the equation. And I think that can make a big difference. So I think that's actually the core of the work we have to think through, how we get there and how we realize these opportunities we've got. So clearly, you know, reaching out to clinicians, it would be very important. I think there are a lot of interesting options, a lot of interesting ideas. We heard one now, you know, organizing a sort of public, visible sort of boycott of prescribing this medication. You know, going to hospitals, because many hospitals have already declared they won't be using this agent. You know, there is a financial incentive built into how this is structured. So, you know, there's going to be a lot of details we're going to have to work out. I think we all recognize and need to recognize that most important are going to be patients and families of people who are suffering from various forms of Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. We know that many of them don't want an expensive placebo with a risk of side effects. They want meaningful help in the lives they have today. I think there's quite a spectrum of opinion within those families and communities. And I know that the Alzheimer's Association doesn't speak for all of them. And in some ways, as we heard tonight, they're a conflicted party in this debate. So strategically, I think that's our focus. We need to figure out how we bring new people into this fight and bring additional pressure to bear. And I think if we can, we have a real shot at winning something. So that's the work. So the RCA membership, I know, is committed to doing that kind of organizing. We're going to be having intensive deliberations over the next few days and weeks. We're going to be looking at a position statement. Many of us have been working on that recently. We'll be sorting out what are the right targets, what are the right demands, what's the right form of outreach, who are the right people we need to reach, and what's the right message. So as Sharon said, if you want to make a difference, you can certainly do that by joining the Right Care Alliance if you're not a member. And even if you want to not necessarily join, but get involved, you know, we're going to be having planning meetings. And if you want to mark your calendars, you know, now's the time, because if you're an active RCA member, we're going to have the next meeting on Monday, August 9th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And so mark it on your calendar and you'll hear from us. If you're new to our organization and you want to talk about what actions are planned and want to get plugged in, we'll be having a follow-up meeting on Saturday, August 14th at 10 a.m. Eastern time. So I think that's really part of our next steps. I think we have to roll up our sleeves, start working together and move forward. If you're in an organization that might want to partner with us, then let us know. Our executive committee is going to be strategizing over the next few days and weeks. You can reach out to me or Steph Ains or to any member of the executive committee, which includes Fred Southwick in Gainesville, David Glenn in Washington, D.C., Claire Paduano here in Boston, Shannon Brownlee, Steph, myself. So absolutely, you know, if you really think about it, this is about truth, justice, and democracy. And I don't think the stakes could be any higher. So I'm glad you all joined us tonight. We got a lot of work to do, and let's get started doing it. Thank you all for attending, and thanks to the planning team. Special thanks to Erin Kesselheim. We really appreciate your taking the time joining us. Special thanks to Linda Ferlini for sharing your story and your perspective. I think it was incredibly important for people to hear. And Peter Whitehouse, thank you for the broad perspective you brought, because I think that really creates the context in which people can understand how abysmal this decision was and how it really should not stand. And last but not least, thank you to all the logistics people who made this thing possible. That includes Alyssa Martin, Ellen Myers, Colleen Fuller. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you on this campaign.